The sun had already set behind the distant hills, casting long shadows over the dry plains. Jack stood on his porch, the cool evening breeze brushing against his face. He was used to the solitude of the ranch. For years he had lived alone in this isolated stretch of land, working the cattle, mending fences, and rarely seeing anyone. Life had always been simple, but it had also been quiet. And Jack preferred it that way. After all, it was easier to keep his past buried when he had no one to answer to. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves. At first it was faint, a distant sound, but it grew louder, coming closer. Jack instinctively reached for the rifle by the door. He wasn't afraid, but he'd learned over the years that in these parts you could never be too careful. Stranger or not, anyone coming to his land at this hour could have their own reasons for doing so. He stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked to meet the rider. As the figure came into view, Jack could make out the silhouette of a woman. She was alone, riding a tired horse that seemed just as weary as its rider. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened slightly, but he held his ground. He wasn't about to make any rash decisions. The woman slowed as she approached him, her face hidden beneath the wide brim of her hat. She was dressed in plain, travel-worn clothes with dust covering every inch of her, but her eyes were full of something else, fear, desperation, perhaps a bit of hope. There was a hint of urgency in the way she urged her horse forward, as if she were running from something or someone. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Jack asked, his voice steady but low. The woman dismounted quickly, her legs shaking as she landed on the ground. She looked at Jack, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "I need your help. They're after me." Jack's instincts flared. He could tell something was off. The woman's clothes were ragged, and the horse she rode looked like it had been running for days without rest. But her words rang true. There was a fear in her voice, a desperation that made Jack hesitate. He had lived long enough to know when a person was lying, and he didn't think she was lying. He took a step forward, lowering the rifle slightly. "Who's after you?" he asked, his tone still calm but now more urgent. The woman glanced over her shoulder as if she expected someone to appear from the darkness. "Men," she whispered. "Men who won't stop until they get what they want." Before Jack could respond, the sound of more horses reached his ears. The woman froze, her face draining of color. Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. A group of riders was approaching fast. They weren't friendly, that much was clear. The woman grabbed her side and reached for something hidden beneath her coat. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he saw the glint of a gun in her hand. He quickly raised his rifle to his shoulder, aiming at her. "Drop it," he commanded sharply. "Now!" For a moment the woman hesitated, the gun still clutched tightly in her hand. But then, to Jack's surprise, she lowered it slowly, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. She didn't seem to want to fight, not really. But the men behind her, whoever they were, clearly had no qualms about violence. She turned back to Jack, her eyes pleading. "Please, I don't want trouble. I just need somewhere safe to go." Jack studied her for a moment, weighing the situation. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this was different. This woman was desperate, and the look in her eyes told him she wasn't someone out to cause harm. "All right," he said, his voice softening. "You can stay here for the night. But you'll have to explain yourself." "What's going on?" Before she could answer, the riders arrived, 5 of them in total. They circled around Jack and the woman, their faces hard and cold. The leader, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, dismounted slowly. He looked at Jack, his eyes scanning him from head to toe, sizing him up. "Well, well," the man said, his voice rough and gravelly. "Looks like you've found yourself a little stray, cowboy." Jack didn't flinch. "I'm not interested in whatever you're looking for," he said firmly. "But if you're here for trouble, you'll find it?" The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You don't know what you're dealing with. This woman's got something that belongs to us, and we're not leaving without it." The woman's face paled even further at the mention of whatever it was she had. Jack's eyes narrowed. He wasn't about to let some stranger come onto his land and threaten him, not without getting answers first. "I'm not asking again," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "You'd better turn around and ride away. Now." The leader of the group laughed darkly. "You think you can stop us? You're just one man." Jack stepped forward, his hand never leaving his rifle. He didn't want to fight, but he wasn't about to back down either. "I don't care how many of you there are. This is my land. You've got 1 minute to turn around. The leader's face twisted in anger and he reached for his own gun. But before he could draw it, the woman stepped between them. She held her hands out, palms up, as if to stop both men from reaching for their weapons. Please, she begged, don't do this. I'm not worth dying for. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The man with the scar stared at the woman, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. But after a moment he looked back at Jack and sneered. Fine, he spat. But this ain't over. We'll be back. You can count on that. With a final glare at the woman, the men turned and rode off into the night, disappearing into the shadows of the desert. Jack watched them leave, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had no idea what kind of trouble this woman was in, but he could feel it. It was only just beginning. Turning back to her, Jack lowered his rifle. The woman didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, her face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Thank you, she whispered, her voice shaky. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped them. Jack didn't answer at first. He didn't know what to say. He had done what anyone would have done, right? But something in him stirred, a part of him that hadn't felt alive in years. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, grateful yet vulnerable. He couldn't just send her off into the night, not now. Come on, he said gruffly. You can stay here for the night. We'll figure this out in the morning. The woman nodded, too tired to argue. She followed him into the house, the weight of the night still hanging over them both. Jack wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long while he felt like something was about to change, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't all bad. The night was quiet, too quiet for Jack's liking. He sat in his chair by the fire, the soft glow casting shadows across the walls of his small ranch house. The woman, who had introduced herself as Sarah, had fallen asleep on the couch, curled up with a blanket around her. The sound of her shallow breathing filled the room, and for the first time in years, Jack didn't feel so alone. But there was no denying the unease that gripped him. The men who had chased Sarah, whoever they were, weren't going to just give up. Jack knew trouble when he saw it, and this wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones. He glanced over at Sarah, wondering what she had been through to end up in this situation. She had been through so much already, and yet she still seemed so fragile. He knew she was hiding something, but he hadn't pressed her for answers. He wasn't one to ask questions about a person's past. Jack had his own secrets, things he never talked about, and he figured that everyone deserved a little space to keep their history to themselves. The night stretched on, the winds outside howling against the walls. Jack sat up, the creaking of the old chair sounding louder than usual in the silence. The fire was starting to die down, so he got up to stoke it. The warm glow of the embers filled the room, but it didn't do much to calm his racing thoughts. He returned to his chair and sat, staring into the fire, lost in thought. Suddenly, there was a soft knock on the door. Jack tensed, his hand instinctively going to the rifle at his side. His heart raced for a moment, but then the voice came. Jack? It was Sarah's voice. She sounded hesitant, as though she wasn't sure if she should disturb him. He sighed, relieved but curious. Come on in, he called. The door creaked open and Sarah stepped in, her eyes tired but determined. I'm sorry to wake you, but I can't sleep, she said, her voice soft. Jack nodded, gesturing to the chair across from him. You want to sit down? She hesitated for a moment, then nodded and walked over to the chair, settling into it. She didn't say anything for a long time, and Jack didn't push her. Instead, he focused on the fire, letting the silence settle between them. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice low. I should have told you earlier, she said, her words heavy with guilt. About why they were chasing me, but I was scared. Jack didn't look at her, but his grip on the rifle loosened slightly. You don't have to explain anything if you don't want to, he said quietly. You've been through enough. She shook her head, her hands fidgeting in her lap. No, I think you deserve to know. After what you did for me, I owe you that much. Jack turned his gaze to her, his eyes softening. He didn't know what to expect, but he could tell she was struggling. It's all right, he said gently. Take your time. Sarah took a deep breath and looked down at her hands as if gathering the courage to speak. I had a family once, she began. A mother and father and a little sister. We lived in a town a few days' ride from here, and we were happy. But everything changed when a man came into our lives, one of those who think they can just take what they want. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. He could feel the tension in the air, and he didn't like where this was going. His name was Gregor, Sarah continued. He was cruel violent. At first he seemed like just another man trying to make a name for himself, but then he started coming around our place, offering to buy our land. He wasn't interested in negotiating. He wanted control. Jack's jaw tightened. Didn't you fight back? Sarah's eyes flickered with pain, and for a moment she looked like she might break. We tried. We did everything we could. But when my father refused to sell, Gregor came for us. One night he took my sister, kidnapped her. He told my parents that if we didn't give him the land, he'd never see her again. Jack's blood ran cold. He could feel the anger building inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. And then what happened? He asked quietly. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with the ghosts of the past. My father gave in. He didn't want to lose my sister, so he signed the land over to Gregor. But that wasn't enough. Gregor still wanted more. He came after me. That's why I ran. Jack's heart ached for her. It was hard to believe that a man could be so ruthless, so heartless. He could understand fighting for land, for power, but to take a young girl, to destroy a family, it went beyond cruelty. It was madness. I'm sorry, Jack said, his voice low and sincere. You've been through more than anyone should have to. Sarah nodded slowly. I had nowhere else to go. I thought I could outrun them, but it's not that easy. They'll stop at nothing to get me back. Jack didn't say anything at first. He could hear the fear in her voice, but he also heard something else. Strength. Despite everything she'd been through, Sarah had survived. She had run and she was still fighting. He leaned forward, his face serious. You don't have to worry about them anymore. Not while you're here, he said. They'll have to come through me first. Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face. You really mean that? Jack nodded firmly. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. There was a long silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, an unspoken agreement that Jack would protect her, and she wouldn't have to face this alone anymore. As the fire crackled softly in the background, Sarah stood up, walking over to where Jack sat. She reached out a trembling hand, placing it on his shoulder. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know what this means to me. Jack looked up at her, his eyes soft. You don't owe me anything. Just get some rest. We'll figure it out tomorrow. Sarah gave him a small smile, her face weary but grateful. She turned and made her way back to the couch where she settled in for the night. Jack stayed by the fire for a little longer, his mind racing with thoughts of the men who were still after Sarah. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of purpose. He wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. As the fire burned low and the house grew quiet, Jack finally stood and walked to his door, closing it with a soft click. The night outside was dark, but he wasn't afraid. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin, but for tonight Jack could rest, knowing that no matter what happened, he would do everything in his power to keep Sarah safe. And that was a promise he would keep.